Let's have a little talk about cultural appropriation in K-pop. K-pop-riation? Whatever. Let me preface this by saying that I know that I am a white woman talking about this, but I've done my research and tried to listen to the people whose cultures are actually being appropriated here so that I can amplify their words instead of just talking about whatever. First, I want to talk about South Korea. It's populated by something like 96% people who are Korean. While this makes for a perfect environment to make people want to find a way to stand out, it also breeds xenophobia, which is a dislike of or prejudice against people from other countries. There's a certain amount of nationalism that goes along with that, or a strong identification with their own country and its interest to the exclusion or detriment to the interest of other nations. There are a lot of reasons for this. Until relatively modern times, worldwide trade with Korea didn't really exist. They had a long-standing war with Japan that discouraged that. In 1945, that war with Japan was ultimately why we have North Korea and South Korea in the first place. After Japan surrendered to the Allied forces, Koryo, as it was called at the time, was split into two zones of occupation. The North Zone was Soviet-controlled, and the South Zone was US-controlled. That probably tells you a lot about why those countries are the way that they are. The Korean people had experienced a lot of racism coming from Japan. Even though a lot of people will look at anyone who's East Asian and just assume that they're kind of the same, there are still tensions between Japan and Korea, and several other countries there. It's part of why there are issues with K-pop groups having members from other countries, even though they're generally embraced in the long term as long as they can speak Korean. Or as long as they can sing in Korean. The speaking, they're allowed a little bit more leeway. They still have to learn, but yeah. We've seen issues with this in the past, where an artist who is not from Korea expresses some type of sentiment that is positive about their home country, but goes against what Korea wants. So even though they're supporting something that is good for them, their family, their country, it's still looked down upon, and they end up having to apologize. It's political. And the fact that they continue to promote and tour in all of these other countries, even though they have some tensions there, just shows that money can heal some wounds, or at least cover them up enough that they're willing to do a lot. Now let's get back to that standing out thing. When everyone kind of looks like you, and there are cultural things in place about following rules, there's definitely a part of a lot of people that wants to be noticed instead of blending into the background. The idea of a uniform is to make it where everyone has on the same clothes so that they're not distracting and that they automatically follow the dress code. But look at how many people you know who, when forced to wear a uniform, do what they can to look different. This is an intrinsic part of Korean pop culture. Standing out. You have to be seen. And that means being different. And ultimately, when you live in a country like Korea, where so many of the people are of the same ethnicity, you end up looking elsewhere for influence because that's where the different things are. In the 1940s, with the US having occupation in South Korea, they brought with it a lot of American customs. There were also roughly 2,000 African American soldiers who served during that conflict as part of segregated forces. There were also roughly 2,000 African American soldiers who served during that conflict as part of segregated troops and were subject to intense racism as part of it, even though none of their commanding officers found them to have any actual poor performance. Seeing this treatment of black people by the soldiers who supposedly saved them likely set in place a trend to have similar thoughts. We know from a bunch of K-pop incidents that full-on minstrel-like performances are not absent from this narrative. A group called the Bubble Sisters, in full blackface, with box braids, hair in curlers, plastic lips on when they performed. They said it was a gimmick to showcase their talent behind something not pretty. I mean, and yet 21 had a similar beginning, but managed to not do blackface. CL had her own issues with this during her solo career when she decided she needed to wear grills, something that is traditionally part of black pop culture, but different story. This type of minstrel act is all about associating certain features and behaviors and the like with black people. When they're played as humorous, it is, of course, telling everyone that black people are the joke. There are numerous artists like Wendy from Red Velvet and Yuri from Girls' Generation who have had scandals about the fact that they intentionally acted black, doing neck rolls and exaggerated types of yelling and speaking roughly. Mamamoo put on blackface to do a performance of Uptown Funk. Tae Yang of Big Bang popped on a Kanye West face filter to wish people a
Happy Monkey New Year,
when monkey is often used as a slur against black people. Those are extreme examples, but there are a ton of others. Look at any K-pop artist who has worn cornrows or do-rags. I love ITZY, but I still have to note that Yeji was given locks to wear, and she called it swag hair. Look at Jessie's latest video for Nunu Nana and the almost comical size of her lips paired with dance elements like twerking that are directly taken from Caribbean dance styles where people are predominantly black. I did a reaction to the Rain JYP collab Twitch to me a few days ago and had to add a comment about how it was very clearly influenced by 1980s R&B like Bobby Brown's Every Little Thing and Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation because the costumes drew direct comparisons. It walks the line a little bit between appropriation and appreciation, but ultimately seems to fall a lot more toward appreciation because the act they're putting on as those characters is not mocking anyone except themselves. Too often, there's a penchant for leaning more toward the idea of the black person as someone beyond tough and into criminal. They're portrayed as though they're in gangs. Quite often, Korean fashion goes down this line and goes down other paths as led by black designers, and yet they never bother to use a black model in a campaign. Zico from Block B had a line in the song Bermuda Triangle about having a yellow face but a black soul. Sure, you might be able to take that a few ways, but it's likely referring to skin color, a la the idea of the person who's an Oreo, aka black outside but white inside. I think we all know that black culture is pulled from a lot in K-pop, but it's not the only one. Tiana's Ya 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 MV full-on uses the idea of a primitive indigenous tribe kidnapping a man who crash lands on their island. Only, they do it while wearing costumes that are straight out of a well-meaning American First Thanksgiving play. The logo at the beginning literally has a teepee. This video idea came about because I gave a throwaway mention to the fact that IU had a small, pet-sized teepee in the scene for her Sloppy Live 3, which is appropriative of Native American cultures. There are a few other cultures that have developed similar styles of tents, yes, but the teepee has become an aesthetic thing in a lot of places, even though it's presenting cultural aspects of many Native American Plains tribes without acknowledgement of them. That's what cultural appropriation is. It's not at all unusual to see a Korean variety show where someone wears a cheap-looking feathered headdress. This is something that is reserved for only the most respected members of tribes, chiefs, elders, warriors. Anyone else wearing them is akin to putting on a military uniform with a lot of badges of honor, only you've never actually served in the military. It's stolen valor, not an aesthetic. Being in Asia, as Korea is, they're not exempt from stealing from other Asian cultures either. Lee Hyori's Whitesnake borrows the Gayatri Mantra, a Vedic prayer associated with the divine and pure, said to be one of the holiest mantras in Hindu culture. And she uses related imagery with both her style and the dance to make it sensual instead. And I'm sure every Blackpink fan is familiar with the release of How You Like That, where they had to go back and change a scene because there was a statue of Lord Ganesh in the background. They used a holy symbol of a Hindu deity as set dressing. IZ*ONE and Idol have done show performances with mosques as a background. Oh My Girl still has a fan meeting video up from 2016 of them performing the Curry song and borrowing dance elements of Desi culture. 17 have sung that song a lot too, even though the original Narazo MV contains brownface, and Narazo have apologized for even making that video in the first place. Even the song. It's hard not to note that a lot of the elements that are borrowed from South Asian cultures have some religious symbolism. South Korea is something like 29% Christian, so it's a little harder to discuss whether there's cultural appropriation of Christian elements, or whether this is more of a form of like agnostic art. I don't really know. But this isn't something that I've seen people explicitly discuss, so I can't really amplify anything here. But religion is such a personal thing for so many and can have such evocative imagery. But clearly there are examples of cherry-picking the cool-looking elements without respecting the entire thing, which is cultural appropriation. We even have a good handful of examples of racism toward Mexican people, like when SHINee dressed in stereotypical Mexican costumes to sing the Macarena, a song by Los Del Rio, who are from Spain. So much of this comes from a place of ignorance, which is why we have to speak up when we see it happen. When you aren't educated about another culture and just borrow elements of them because they look cool, you do a disservice to the people of that culture. K-pop artists who wear cornrows do it as a fashion statement, while Black people in America often wear it as a protective style and can have difficulty getting jobs when they do so. They jokingly wear a feathered headdress while Native Americans often live in poverty as their homeland is stripped away along with their rights. They dance in front of mosques, even as the people who would worship there are treated as criminals in a lot of places. In K-pop, rarely are the artists fully educated before they start their training. More often than not now, the trainees start as preteens and spend tons of time learning to sing and dance and act and do interviews, instead of learning so much about the rest of the world. Even if they focus on learning English, it's rarely to be able to communicate about cultural exchange. Now, yours does have a few videos about learning about cultural appropriation, particularly about Black culture. So things are starting to change. We just need to continue to help it along by calling it out when we see it. You can continue to love your favorite artists, even though they don't know better yet. But you should hold them accountable once they've done it once and been chastised for it. Now, most often, it isn't the artists themselves who have these ideas, but rather people on their teams or other organizations that they're working with. Now, new artists are probably much more likely to go along with what their companies are asking with this because they're not moneymakers yet. But we do need to encourage a culture where their companies don't ask for this kind of thing in the first place. It needs to be recognized by all of the people who are directing all of this so that they can make better choices in the first place, so that the ones that we're seeing don't end up in situations where we feel as though we might have to stop being a fan of someone because of that sort of thing. K-pop keeps growing as an international market. When that's the case, it has to evolve to function outside of just Korea. There are so many people in the world whose cultures include elements that are sacred or otherwise important to that culture specifically. They may be willing to share parts of their culture, but it still has to be treated with respect by the person it's shared with to actually be a cultural exchange. Otherwise, it's theft, appropriation. This isn't even getting into the cases of outright racism and using slurs in a lot of cases. It's ignoring the colorism that can be present in a lot of these cases too. There are American-born K-pop artists who should know better in a lot of these cases, but America's pretty racist itself, so they might just be bringing some of that with them when they go to Korea to debut. And it also goes into emulating what they see around them, doing what their companies tell them to do. If your knee-jerk reaction is to automatically forgive your favorite artist, realize that you can be critical of the media you consume and still appreciate it. If the element in question is part of your culture, you can feel however you want to feel. If it's not your culture, listen to the people whose culture it is for guidance. Even there may be some differences of opinion, but it's important that when it's said by these people, you listen. You obviously know that it's not just Korean people who listen to K-pop, but the rest of them aren't just white. So, thanks for hanging out as I discuss this. Feel free to follow me on Twitter, where I post a fair amount about this kind of thing. It may not always be in relation to K-pop, but I get pretty political. And then do this stuff here. Comment below with videos that you want me to do, whether it's reaction videos or something more like this. In the description box, I've got a link to my Patreon and a handful of links that I've used to research this video, where you can go and do a little bit more reading and a little bit more learning. I hope everyone learned a little something from this and will go forward more mindful of the media they consume and about how pop culture can actually affect the world. See you later.